resistance to actually address the crucial problem that faces humanity. Depressing short-termism, and it's never been worse than I think it is today. The easy way of getting nuclear energy is to dig uranium out of the ground. In most instances of the Canadian can-dos, do a little bit of enrichment, collect the electricity, and do something about the waste, or think about doing something about the waste. It's the cheapest way, where basically they would have a reactor that produces electricity for 20 years with no attention whatsoever, and quietly burns its way through its fuel load.
The clock is ticking on climate change, right? The deadlines are looming, and the solutions feel complicated, slow, constantly debated. It's easy to get discouraged, to think it's too big, too hard. But then you meet someone who's been working on the hard parts patiently for decades. Dr. Alistair Miller from ACL, researcher emeritus, nearly 60 years in the game. He wasn't just talking about displacing carbon fuels. He was doing the pioneering work on hydrogen, figuring out how nuclear fits in, even inspiring conferences on things like hydrogen-powered trains. He's been tackling the devastating effects on marine ecosystems. This is a man who understands the long game and the practical science needed to get there. He's the kind of a guest who might restore a little bit of your faith in actual progress. Alistair, welcome.
Thank you.
Before we dive deep into the tech, tell me about you. What was the spark? What made you dedicate your life to nuclear energy? Was there a moment that you just clicked?
Yes, there certainly was a moment when it started. I was just at the end of my third year of four-year undergraduate degree, and I got a studentship at the Harwell site, which was the principal research centre for the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. So I had an exposure to nuclear for 3 months that summer. And I liked what I saw. It was a time when nuclear was very much seen as the way of the future. And my interest was kindled. And so when I went back to university for my final undergraduate year, I looked at the possibilities of doing grad studies in nuclear energy. Fairly naively looked up the calendars of the various universities that offered nuclear, and there weren't all that many nuclear studies. I found Imperial College, which I really at the time had very little idea about how prestigious an institution it was, suggested I might do a graduate study there, do a PhD there, and they said yes, and that set me on the nuclear pathway. Then when I had finished, it's approaching the end of my PhD, I looked at job possibilities, and the UK AEA seemed interested. I had an offer from private industry in the UK, but also had an offer from Atomic Energy of Canada. And since they were offering twice as much money as was being offered in the UK, my wife and I agreed that we would check it out and go for 2 years, even if we didn't like it. And that was almost 60 years ago. Did I?
So amazing. And you're still there.
Yep. And I have been very fortunate to, I mean, not many people can, I suppose, claim to have been involved for virtually 60 years. I've continued to do things throughout my career that I think one would regard as being science, engineering, rather than administrative things, although I did do a certain amount of administrative work. Not as easy nowadays because administration seems to consume almost 100% of the time of people who were in my position as a branch manager at AECL. But in those days, it certainly was possible to continue to do research as well as to good things happen. And I discovered relatively early on that I was much better at modeling things than at actually getting my hands dirty in the lab. And so that's what shaped my career.
And looking back, especially since 2005, what's been the biggest surprise for you in this field?
I guess the reluctance to actually address the crucial problem that faces humanity. Uh,
Yeah.
Depressing short-termism, and it's never been worse than I think it is today. Uh,
Wow, what a sentence. Yeah.
I mean, it's easy. Let me give you an example from the nuclear industry itself. The easy way of getting nuclear energy is to dig uranium out of the ground. In most instances of not the Canadian CANDUs, do a little bit of enrichment, collect the electricity, and do something about the waste, or think about doing something about the waste. It's the cheapest route. It's not the necessarily most sustainable route in terms of the real
Yeah.
term, but it's an example of how one tries to go, it seems, and if one's a policymaker, for the short-term solution, whatever's cheapest, and don't plan for the really long-term needs of the planet. Now, it's good, I guess, to actually deploy the nuclear power, but it is an example of how one tends to go to the quickest, cheapest route.
Yeah. Wow. So working in this industry comes with a baggage, right? Historical fears, public concerns. How does that feel personally? How do you navigate this emotional landscape?
It wasn't always so. I mean, when I joined the nuclear industry, eh, nuclear power was seen as a really promising future technology. And
Yeah.
things began to change, I think, about 1980 or the early 80s. And there was a substantial amount of pure nuclear science at the Chalk River Labs of AECL. And I think it was in 82 that the federal government said, no, we don't really want to spend money on things like accelerating uh, heavy ions. It's costing us money. Uh, Stop doing it. And it was worrying because it was cutting out the long-term underpinning of the industry. By now, the CANDU reactor was well and truly launched and
Mm.
was quite successful. We'd had our early crisis with the supply of heavy water, but I'd had an involvement in solving that particular problem. And nuclear energy seemed to be rolling along quite nicely, but there wasn't apparently any longer the enthusiasm for nuclear science. And it was probably in part a response to the rising concern about nuclear energy that organizations like Greenpeace, Suzuki Foundation had stirred up. And the public never had a very great understanding of the issues behind nuclear power. So it was relatively easy for these organizations to create a climate of concern and change that into a climate of fear and to exploit the outcome for their own personal prosperity.
Hmm.
And we recognized in that cutting back of federal funds for fundamental research that there was a need to create public understanding at a much deeper level than was then in existence. And that was why we, as a very small initiative, founded the Deep River Science Academy. Deep River Science Academy operated for about 28 years, starting in the early 80s. We brought students who were already identified as being high flyers to experience a 6-week exposure to actual nuclear R&D. They actually got out into the labs we hired undergraduate students as their supervisors under the guidance of permanent staff at Chalk River, and pairs of students would be actually immersed in ongoing real research, where there was no answer at the back of the book, as research tended to be in high school exposure. And more than 1,000 students passed through that program, and most of them, I think it's fair to say, were inspired by what they saw. So in a small way, we were trying to build public understanding, public trust, seeding it with people who were going out into careers that weren't necessarily nuclear, but where they would understand how science and engineering actually works, that the apparent uncertainties that always exist in any kind of science were being interpreted by the likes of Greenpeace as being indicative of our not having confidence, rather than asking the sort of questions that should be asked as any kind of ongoing understanding of what's happening. And for people inside the industry, people inside science and engineering, represent the way things should be done, but it was being turned on its head as being, they're not really sure what's going on, and therefore we should avoid doing these kinds of things. They're dangerous. And using a narrow focus that ignored the deeper concerns, which of course now are very much overhanging all humanity, overhanging this planet, in terms of the effects of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and to obviously having effects, as we can see now, temperature rise has exceeded 1.5 degrees, perhaps in a short-term way, but it's definitely headed up. So, focusing on misunderstanding of the concerns, which the industry hadn't done a good job of addressing. We'd been ultra-conservative and saying that perhaps a little bit of radiation might be bad. We know now that's not true, that the linear hypothesis, the idea that small amounts of radiation add up to real adverse effects in terms of cancer rates, just doesn't hold. But we hadn't done a good job of creating that. And so even to this day, we're still seeing pushback from particularly Aboriginal people, in First Nations people in Canada, who really don't have a good understanding, fanned by these deeply rooted anti-nuclear opinions. And they're looking at straws, while the overall picture, as you can understand, is becoming increasingly dire. It really is worrying. So we've done a poor job of trying to educate the public. I'm happy to say that in Ontario, there isn't really a strong anti-nuclear sentiment in terms of the deployment of nuclear power. But when it comes to programs like the low-level waste disposal project that is mooted at Chalk River, has been on the cards for some time, it's still being resisted by concerns that are at the base very pitiful.
So when you look at countries, and now let's go a bit deeper, pursuing standardized reactors versus national designs, which path, in your view, best serves energy independence?
Well, again, it comes back to this business of trying to do things on the cheap. Go the pathway that you already know, and it is relatively cheap. Now, you've obviously heard a great deal about small modular reactors, and there are so many varieties of those things. Most of them won't prove practical. In Canada, they ought to be pursued, if only for their potential use in many of the remote northern areas. Small modular reactors make a lot of sense if they could displace the basically fossil fuel
Mm.
uh, in providing the electricity that these sites need with just ordinary generators. There's history of this in Canada. Way back in the early heyday of nuclear energy, ACL devised the slowpoke reactor. Slowpoke reactor was basically a neutron source, and a number of them were built in Canada. One, I think, was also built in Jamaica. Uh, they weren't to produce power, they were strictly a source of neutrons. The Chinese picked up on the idea and basically undercut the Canadian idea, but there is tradition of this. And I remember visiting one of the sites at the University of Toronto where there was a slowpoke, and the thing just sat there. No one was supervising it. It was properly licensed by the regulators, but it was totally passive. And it's that kind of route that I think we need to look at to extend nuclear energy across, particularly the north, but perhaps also, and there seems to be enthusiasm for this in certainly Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, and perhaps in Alberta as well, where we can broaden the reach of nuclear energy and do what's already happened in Ontario, where now we have well over 90% of our electricity is generated by non-emitting methods, 60% of it being nuclear, the rest being wind and solar. So there is a lot of scope there. Some of the designs are particularly attractive, but I see that as being a very positive development for which there is considerable enthusiasm in Canada today.
So forgive me if this sounds simple, but people often see nuclear and renewables as competing. What's the profound, maybe even beautiful synergy between them that's completely overlooked?
Yeah, well, I guess you're referring to the work that we did on what we called New Wind, NUWIND, where back in the mid 2000s, we examined the actual generation of electricity in Ontario and Alberta, which are the only two jurisdictions in Canada where there are actually free-floating values on the electricity. And we looked at the possibility of taking the low-cost periods and converting it into hydrogen, with the hydrogen being stored in underground caverns in very much the same way that natural gas is stored. It's known technology. It's been practiced for a very long time. And then having looked at what the cost of hydrogen would by taking advantage of the periods when the value of the electricity was very low, typically between about midnight and 6 in the morning, turn it into hydrogen, store it, provide the hydrogen on a continuous basis or an as needed basis for transportation, which is one of the difficult areas to get off hydrocarbons. And then we put on top of that basic supply of low cost electricity, up to 20% additional electricity coming from wind. And wind, of course, is undependable. It's not just undependable on the sort of daily or weekly basis, it's undependable on a seasonal basis. And while batteries have got better and better in terms of cost, the ability to store electricity, they can't address the seasonality of wind and solar energy,
Yeah.
electricity. You get, in Ontario at least, more than twice as much on an average electricity generated from wind in winter months as you get in the summer months. And there's just no way that batteries can store that. But what we did with New Wind was to look at adding the available wind when it actually blew, looking at real data, on top of what was coming from this basically steady supply of electricity with a variable value. Add the wind energy as well on top of the stuff that was coming from nuclear by changing the voltage, changing the current density, really changes the voltage of the generation of the hydrogen. And it worked beautifully. One could do 20% wind on top of the nuclear, and it actually lowered the cost. So it was a lovely synergy. It still makes sense because the demand does not match the base supply, the steady supply of electricity that's coming from the nuclear plants. And turning it into hydrogen for this difficult to supply transportation market, not all of it. I mean, when it comes to cars, like use the lithium batteries. They're far superior in terms of efficiency. But there are difficult areas like long haul rail, which I promoted a long time ago, as being an obvious place. Marine long haul, you can't do those with batteries. It's encouraging actually that in Canada, Canadian Pacific, KPCC, as they call themselves now, are actually experimenting with a couple of mainline locomotives which are used to fuel cells. And they seem to like what they're seeing because they've just announced a new order for 100 switchers that would again be based on fuel cells. So they're happy with the technology. And I can see that this is a real opportunity for Canada and for other North American jurisdictions as well, if there is the genuine desire to abate greenhouse gas emissions, which of course south of the border seems to have rather fallen away at the moment.
Let's talk SMR. Headlines are everywhere. It's a game changer. But then you see the costs, the delays. Are they genuinely disruptive, or could they be an overstated niche?
I think there is an opportunity here. Now, I'm pleased that Canada seems to be promoting it. But as I said, there are all sorts of SMRs. A number of things need to be in place for them to be adopted. Obviously, they have to be reasonably affordable, but reasonably affordable in terms of certainly the northern remote sites. The cost of diesel to fuel those is pretty high because the diesel has generally to be flown in. So there's a real opportunity there. But having said that the economics may well make sense for that, then clearly they also have to be relatively secure, not needing much in the way of supervision. And some of the designs, I really like that. There's one, TerraPower has a concept, so-called traveling wave concept, where basically they would have a reactor that produces electricity for 20 years with no attention whatsoever, and quietly burns its way through its fuel load. It's a very attractive approach because as soon as you start it up, it's not really going to be an attractive target for anyone that wants to get hold of any of the fuel because it's highly radioactive. It just sits there in their concept and produces electricity.
And for the next generation, Gen 4 reactors, what's the single biggest barrier to getting them built and running if it's not technical?
Cost. Yeah, it's the cheap and nasty. Do it the way that you know. You dig up the uranium with the CANDU, you don't need to enrich it. Don't worry about the plutonium that you've produced as a byproduct in that, which could recycle. And some of the other SMR ideas do look at the possibility of reprocessing, but reprocessing costs money. So the easiest thing is just to go with the known way, the cheap and nasty, almost you could call it. Safe enough, it works. There's lots of uranium around, particularly in Canada. So it's unfortunate that we're not looking, as usual, not looking at the far future. I mean, there's enough uranium around to provide all the electricity that the world needs for 1 million years. It's not a resource that in any practical sense could be considered as limited. But you do need to go a bit beyond getting something like 0.7% of the energy out of the uranium fuel in the first place. And that's where Gen 4 type reactors could well turn out to be useful. But again, you have to have a longer vision than most politicians seem to be prepared to apply. And the big argument is keep the cost of living down, and no matter how you do it, this is driving political decisions.
And following on from that, is there a quiet fear that by the time these advanced reactors are ready, the energy landscape will have shifted so much that they're almost irrelevant?
I think that has validity. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. We will need to continue with what we've got in terms of providing the backbone. And yes, the timeframes are very short. We've probably got the balance of this decade to really address the greenhouse gas problem. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be planning for the decades beyond, when finally you get to a point of looking at how do you deploy totally carbon-free, or virtually totally carbon-free source of energy for the planet.
And with new fuels for some designs, what are the critical geopolitical risks or dependencies we might be creating right now?
It's a hard question. I don't think there are real risks of going the way we should be going. And the basic issue is to let the public understand the magnitude of the problem we're creating and the benign nature of deploying combination of nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal as well, I would think, conceivably even mining hydrogen the way that has lately captured people's imagination.
Yeah.
It's a funny dichotomy in that it seems to be a curious enthusiasm for exploiting fusion energy. And fusion perhaps gives an example of what the fission industry should have been doing, and that fusion somehow has captured the public imagination by glossing over the very real problem of having to produce tritium, breed tritium as a part of the fuel going into the fusion cycle. And they either raised concern about that or really tackled how to do it. I'm pleased to say that Chalk River is actually working with the Japanese on understanding how to handle that fuel cycle. But fusion is decades away from being a useful source. There's all sorts of interesting work being done there, but somehow they've managed to sell that to the public as a way forward that the public can accept. And it should be an example to the fishing community how to do things. Education of the public is at the heart of all of this. And yeah, I think people are aware of the deep problem of what we're doing to the planet, but they need to be enthusiastic about how to address it. And at the moment, with fission energy, nuclear energy as we have it today, there's at best acceptance. It's not definitely say overall, but less than the kind of enthusiasm that would be really good to address this deeper problem there. We are really threatening the whole planetary ecosystem.
We'll get back to educating public, but let's talk money. What fundamental shifts are needed to make building new nuclear consistently economically competitive today?
Oh, I mean, in terms of what Ontario is trying to do, is planning to do in terms of new nuclear, there isn't an issue. Yes, you have to put money up front, but nuclear, once you've committed the actual reactors, is, as you appreciate, very, very cheap to operate. And we have, I think, demonstrated in Ontario with the fleet of CANDU reactors that it does make very cheap electricity. Yes, you have to put capital in the front end, but once you've done that, the CANDU type of reactor was demonstrated that it's virtually immortal. The pressure tubes have a lifetime of 25 to 30 years, but they can be replaced. And provided the outer calandria, stainless steel vessel that surrounds it, that doesn't deteriorate, there's work going on at Chocolate to understand that. I think it's probably not an issue. These reactors can go on generating electricity at very low cost, and the cost of refurbishment is very easily recovered. But Ontario has demonstrated that, yeah, they like the idea economically, and the Ontario government is, if nothing else, is focused on keeping costs down. They think that the nuclear is the right way to go forward in terms of meeting the demand for electricity that's expected to double in places like Ontario, Canada in general, in the period of next 25 years or so.
And how do you even begin to compete with falling cost of renewables given nuclear's high upfront capital and perceived risk?
Well, yeah, strictly perceived risk, because I don't really think there is significant risk, either in terms of failing to produce the electricity or in terms of impact on the environment, in terms of radiation release, which is so trivial as to be absolutely unimportant. And the background of radiation that we get from the environment, from rocks and from cosmic rays, vastly bigger. It's a fraction of a percent, anything could conceivably come from nuclear reactors. Now, okay, wind, yeah, gets cheaper and cheaper, but wind has its limitations. It's really so, as I was saying, unreliable in the long term. Yes, you can feed it in as a part of the electricity source, but it's going to have huge difficulties if you are totally dependent on it, because you have periods when the wind drops to nothing, cold winter nights, high pressure system sitting over things. Yeah, you can ameliorate it to some degree by integrating electricity grids over longer and longer areas. But why would you want to rely entirely on sources that are intrinsically unreliable?
Yeah.
Even if, when they do happen to producing, they produce it cheaply, when you've got another source that is comparably affordable, that is totally reliable.
Something fascinating is seeing old plants restarted. What does that tell you deep down about how the market or maybe governments truly value nuclear's reliability?
It's a positive development, yes. And it's interesting, again, coming back to Ontario, which is the place I know best. The plan had been to shut down permanently the 4 smaller reactors of Pickering B, and that was reversed. And the government has decided that those 4 reactors should be retubed and continue to operate. The Pickering A reactors are basically regarded as almost prototypical, and they're not doing anything with those. But yeah, Pickering B has been recognized as having real value, being a very attractive source of low-cost electricity if they're retubed, and they're going to be retubed. And we've got very good at retubing. The early experience with retubing was problematical, frankly awful. But now our reactors can be retubed at the expected schedule and cost. So there's no problem with that, and they're recognized as being a very good source of baseload electricity without the complications of intermittent renewables.
Waste management. Deep geological repositories are the plan, but progress is slow. Is the concept flawed, or is it mainly a failure of political will and engaging people?
The latter. It's a failure of political will. But the will has not failed completely. I mean, ACL did do a 10-year experiment in Manitoba. And we demonstrated that you could take spent fuel, which is currently stored perfectly safely in air-cooled situations, concrete canisters at the actual sites. You could take that spent fuel and deposit it in the deep granitic plutons that characterize the Canadian Shield and contain it safely in perpetuity for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. So the technology was demonstrated, and we now actually have a point where we have a site that has accepted the idea of applying that technology in northwestern Ontario. So we do know how to do it. I'm not sure that it's the right thing to do. There's still more than 90%, 99% of the energy in that fuel that is basically being consigned to garbage, which is a shame. And one of the other interesting SMR routes that New Brunswick has been pioneering, so it doesn't look at the moment as if it's certain that it will go ahead. Moltex have an alternative approach to geological storage, where basically they would separate out the plutonium from the, the spent fuel and use that as a fuel in their SMR. So I think the right way to go for the long term, but we're still bedeviled, of course, this huge availability of raw uranium, beyond that of thorium, which is something like 2 to 4 times more abundant than uranium. So it's not a real problem. The problem is technically solved. It is, I'm happy to say, seemingly being pursued in a very careful, almost a leisurely way in Ontario. And I think it is now on a fairly clear pathway. So it's not, it was never really a serious concern, because when you recognize that uranium has 6 orders of magnitude more energy in it than carbon fuels, it's comparatively easy to manage the waste. With carbon fuels, we're completely incapable of managing it just because there is so much of it. And the efforts to actually capture CO2 and store it, yeah, okay, it's work being done, but it's less than convincing, and the time frame looks hopelessly inadequate.
And closing the fuel cycle, is that a truly necessary long-term goal, or potentially an expensive, proliferation-prone distraction from safe disposal?
In the short term, you could probably say it is a distraction. But in the long term, it's there. It would be good if geological storage was retrievable. So at the moment, that doesn't look to be the route that's being taken. But it's more of an answer to criticism that uranium is not an infinite source. As I said earlier on, there's enough energy in uranium to last for 1 million years. Throw in thorium as well. You have to burn all of the capacity. But you can do it. It's not, there's no technical difficulty with that. It just costs you a bit more money. But it's nice to be able to have that in your back pocket and say, look, we don't have an issue with this. We can get energy out of uranium and thorium that will supply humanity as long as we conceivably see. We'll have perhaps captured fusion by then. But it's more of something that we can say, look, the concern that we run out of uranium is not founded in any reality.
And let's go back to the public trust. Beyond PR, how can the industry genuinely, authentically rebuild trust with people who have real safety concerns? What does that actually look like?
As I said, the fusion people perhaps point the way to do that, and yet there has to be honesty as well. And the fusion community, I don't think, can be claimed 100% upfront in terms of issues. As I say, mostly with this tritium breeding requirement, which they don't really know how to handle. So we need to work harder at explaining to the public that it was an excess of caution in terms of concerns over possible effects of radiation. The linear hypothesis is dead. And we need to get that message across so that the idea that one atom of a radioactive nature is bad, it really isn't true. And the industry has to face explaining that in a way to the public that would take out that lingering concern that radiation from nuclear energy somehow is bad. And it shouldn't be too difficult to do because cheerfully accept X-rays, which give them far more with ionizing radiation than you conceivably ever get from even the worst forms of nuclear mismanagement. And set all of that in the context of the need to address the climate change issue. So it's not a hard story to tell, but the story has to be told honestly, and it has to be told in a way that recognizes that we had an excess of caution in what was known as a LARA, as low as reasonably achievable release of radiation to the environment. It cost us a huge amount of money, unnecessarily so. So that message has to be got across to the public within the context of the broader need to get off carbon in all its forms.
Canada has a unique history with AECL and CANDU in today's complex geopolitical landscape. What specific, maybe even uncomfortable role should Canada be playing in global nuclear governance and safety?
I think perhaps there is some message that could be got from the Ontario experience. I think really only France and perhaps China, as it's headed, can claim that kind of level of comfort. And the root of the CANDU type reactor has been, I think, muscled aside by the American-backed light water industry. They've been quite unprincipled, probably, in how they have tended to promote their light water technology. And in fairness, one of the early attributes of CANDU was, of course, its ability to burn uranium as it was on the ground. Light water reactors require enrichment of uranium-235. But that benefit has been undercut as centrifuge technology took over from the gaseous diffusion in terms of producing uranium enrichment. Nonetheless, you get better overall utilization of uranium in the CANDU type reactor, and you have less dependence on the few countries that actually are able to enrich uranium. Much of the enriched uranium goes into reactors worldwide, like water reactors, including the American ones, comes from Russia. It's so CANDU has a role to play there that should appeal to developing countries, and provides them with an alternative to the light water route with the ongoing dependency on technology that is held in a relatively small number of countries.
And was there ever a moment, maybe after an accident or political setback, when you just doubted the future of nuclear, doubted your path?
Well, obviously, there were a number of incidents where things were badly mismanaged, but despite even Chernobyl, which of course is the extreme example, which clearly set back the role of nuclear power for a decade more, the actual impact was very hard to detect. There was no search of cancers of Chernobyl other than some degree of higher incidence of thyroid cancers in children, decidedly treatable in that immediate area, but that's still debated as to whether that was an effect of an excessive doses of potassium iodide pills, which were handed out by sweeties to people who had been exposed. There was not an effect in terms of detectable increase in cancer rates for what was quite clearly the worst accident of nuclear power that the planet has ever experienced, and was the result of directives and totally asinine execution project that should never have been attempted, where you're trying to generate minimum electricity reactor that's been shut down and just seeing what we get out of spinning turbines. It didn't make sense at all. It's totally stupid. But even then, even with this considerable release of some fairly long-lived fission fragments, cesium, strontium, no observable effect. It worried people dreadfully. And it comes back to our sticking to the linear hypothesis long after it's been discredited.
And let's do what if. What if we fail to deploy nuclear alongside renewables fast enough? What does that future look like and feel like to you?
Disastrous. I mean, I've been involved in this for 6 decades. So I've been, I hope, on the sides of the solutions, but the uptake is painfully slow. Some good things are. I mean, the falling price of wind and solar, appreciation of geothermal can contribute. The role of nuclear being accepted, but there is progress, but it's not nearly fast enough. And of course, we backslid considerably in terms of what the drill baby drill phenomenon south of the border is posing. We're on our way to changing the planetary environment in ways that are potentially dire and conceivably almost irreversible, because there are feedback loops that we don't understand properly, particularly the release of carbon from melting permafrost and the visible reduction of permanent ice in the Arctic. These are sources of concern that we should be scared to very depths. And then, of course, we haven't touched on the effects of ocean acidification. We'll perhaps get to that a little later. But, this is a big thing in the planet. And not appreciating, it seems, with any kind of urgency. Okay, so Canada's not doing too badly on that. But even in Canada, we had a very sensible policy of gradually raising the price on carbon dioxide emissions. And it was progressing nicely. We were raising it $15 per ton a year. We've got $75 a ton. And we've done a very poor job, politicians have done a very poor job explaining how it operated, because the tax was being remitted back to the taxpayers. Virtually 90% of it as checks that they got every 6 months. But somehow we didn't do a good enough job of explaining what was going on. And so it became politically unpalatable, and we have gone back to no price on carbon at the consumer level that we previously had. Price of gas has dropped, so everyone's saying, but in reality, it's really a backsliding misstep.
You have a deep scientific understanding, and what's your critical take on ideas like ocean alkalinity enhancement or other geoengineering for CO2 removal? Are they feasible, safe, and could nuclear play a role?
We don't know. we know how. There are various ideas of geoengineering, and the more prominent ones are to somehow decrease the incoming flux of energy from the sun. And they could work, although they do have downsides. I mean, everyone recognizes that to, for example, seed the stratosphere with sulfate particles that would in fact reflect sunlight back to some degree into space, would have an overall positive effect in reducing the buildup of temperature in the atmosphere. But it wouldn't do it painlessly. There would be disruptions to the climate that probably would have some areas suffering and other areas overall benefiting. There are other approaches, low-level ones, like enhancing the low-level clouds reflectivity, undoing some of the unfortunate effects of SO2 abatement, which seem to be enhancing the warming of the planet by stopping formation of low-level clouds. But uniquely, only routes that would actually reduce CO2 in the atmosphere will be of any value to the oceans. And it's so unfortunate that the extreme climate activists who are so insistent on somehow curtailing CO2 emissions in a way that was so far proved completely ineffective. Yeah, we're going in the right direction, not nearly fast enough. They've resisted geoengineering solutions in general, and in particular the experiments that should be done to show how we can enhance, whether we can, probably we can, enhance the absorption of CO2 in the oceans. The oceans soak up about half of the CO2 that actually is emitted, but they're only soaking it up in terms of dissolving it, principally dissolving it in the oceans, which is what's increasing their acidity, decreasing the alkalinity, with potentially really dire effects on the phytoplankton that are the basis of the food chain for the oceans, and provide about half of the generation of oxygen into the planet's atmosphere. We're not about the amount of oxygen, but this just shows how fundamental that system is. That phytoplankton, that little plant-like plankton organisms that absorb sunlight, do photosynthesis, convert CO2 into oxygen, And some of what they've done then rains down into the depths of the oceans. It's fixed calcium carbonate. It's a system that we really do need to understand, I would hope exploit on a big scale, where we can enhance the performance of the phytoplankton, and one would hope enhance the outcome in terms of their actual long-term sequestration of CO2 in the carbonate rain to the depths of the oceans. But we haven't done enough work on it, and it's being resisted by these hair-shirt environmentalists who want to do it their purest way, but really isn't working. And in the meantime, the oceans are acidic, and we just don't know how robust the phytoplankton are to the effects of it. But we do know that higher levels of acidity attack carbonate shells that much of that phytoplankton depends on, tends to dissolve it. And we're still headed willy-nilly in that direction as the CO2 concentration builds up. So it's something that we have proposals how to fertilize the oceans, how to study the effects of fertilization, basically adding iron initially as a sulfate, maybe better ways of doing it, which iron is deficient in much of the ocean water, but deficient to the point it's limiting the activity of the phytoplankton. What else it would do, we just didn't know. We need to do those experiments. There are proposals to do that. We need to proceed with those with great urgency, because even the experiments are viewed as a 5-year lead time, and it's time that we barely have. So I would say that is one of the huge issues. We really are dependent on those phytoplankton underlying level of the atmosphere, let alone it being the bottom of the food chain in terms of the whole ocean productivity in terms of fish.
Are we aware of the danger we're in?
Probably not. I mean, I think there is a general understanding of the effects of rising temperatures, but in terms of the effects on the oceans, no, I don't think we've done a good job of it. And of course, it's not really the nuclear industry's job to explain that. It's something that the oceanographers and climatologists ought to be stressing. I mean, it's in there in the reports of the UN study of all of this, but somehow it hasn't got across to the public to the degree that it should. Perhaps because it's just not as visible. We see the effects in weather. You have to be blind not to realize that our winters, Canada at least, and in Europe too, are being shortened, disrupted by global warming. But when it comes to the oceans, people noticing the effects on the phytoplankton, and the answer is no.
No.
And that's a horrid gap, because it is really a huge problem, and there's no way that we can see in the foreseeable future of abating CO2 in any other way that would have the kind of effect that this fertilization of the ocean to enhance the performance of phytoplankton could probably do. They can do direct capture from here, but that's a distraction that the oil industry likes to wave in front of people in terms of an actual impact in CO2 levels. It's just not on. Ideas of spreading crushed silica rock, well, okay, might be a good idea, but worth trying too. But again, it's hard to see how that could be the kind of scale that we could get from somehow enhancing the capture of CO2 in the oceans and the capture walking away.
Okay, final question. If you had a magic wand, one global policy change to accelerate the safe use of nuclear energy worldwide, what would it be?
The magic wand would to get people to understand the linear effect is dead. It was never more than an overzealous concern might have been understanding that the nuclear energy point of view of any kind of research is totally been. Get that message across, then we all the way forward to unleashing the capability of nuclear with renewables, other sources, non-emitting of electricity. And we are, let's end on a positive note, we are moving toward an increasingly electrified energy source in the area that's in need of it, the transportation side. There are gaps. Doing it with planes is still something that is decades away. Can be done, I think, with hydrogen as a fuel for planes. Can be ameliorated in the short term by trying to operate planes in a way that doesn't produce the heat trapping effects of contrails. But if we get away from the idea nuclear is harmful because we, as an industry, overstress potential concerns, turn not to be.
Alistair, thank you so much for being my guest today.
My pleasure. Hope it helps.
Looking to amplify your brand in the hydrogen energy sector? Welcome to H2 Energy News, your go-to platform for impactful industry insights. Every month, we connect with over 80,000 visitors and generate more than 251,000 page views. Our reach is unmatched with over 1.2 million web impressions and a loyal social media following of 9,000 plus. Our newsletter reaches 77,000 plus subscribers, decision makers, industry leaders, and innovators. Want to target specific markets? Our geo-targeting capabilities cover Europe, the United States, and the MENA region. We reach key stakeholders, 27% senior executives, 32% directors, and 20% owners and partners. H2. Energy News isn't just a news platform, it's where the hydrogen energy community converges to shape the future. Join us and let's make an impact together. Visit energynews.biz and take your brand to the next level.